Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 10 a.m. Got a great show lined up for you today. With baby boomers entering retirement, more people are retiring than ever before, and numerous studies have shown the majority of boomers are not financially prepared to go decades without a steady paycheck. Dr. Pfau's book is written to help retirement-minded people, whether they are on the verge of retirement or just starting their professional life, spend in a way that allows them to live comfortably without having to worry about running out of money. Our guest today is Dr. Wade Pfau, who is the author of his newest book, How Much Can I Spend in Retirement? Excited to have him on the show, and we will do a deep dive in not only safe withdrawal rates when it comes to retirement, but a deep discussion on optimal withdrawal rates. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. He will be joining us very, very shortly. But if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know we always reserve just the first few minutes of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on when it comes to financial literacy in the Houston and Gulf Coast region. You've been hearing me talk about Houston Money Week, which is something that's going to happen in April of next year, so of 2018, even though we're here in December. Seems like it's far down the road, but it's really not that far at all. We have been ramping up and getting started and getting ready for Money Week, which started out about 10 years ago, because this is our 10-year anniversary this year. Started out 10 years ago as kind of piggybacking on National Financial Literacy Week. What started out as just a week-long celebration of bringing financial literacy and financial education to low to moderate income here in Houston has become an entire month-long event. And it has gone from just a single nonprofit or group initiative to nonprofits, local city government, local schools, colleges. The mayor was on board, Bank on Houston, United Way, many different agencies and organizations, banks doing community reinvestment here in Houston, have all joined together for the Houston Money Week initiative that takes place in April of 2018. The reason I mention this once again is that we are having a partners meeting next week, December 12th at 2 p.m. That's going to be at the United Way. Now, since I'm on the leadership team and I have joined with Houston Money Week, I have seen this group grow from a small organization to many different groups across Houston. Our footprint is very, very large when it comes to getting the message out about financial literacy. I would encourage any organizations, companies that are wishing to have speakers come out and talk about financial literacy, credit. We work with the VITA program during tax time. If you are interested to reach out, you can find out more at houstonmoneyweek.org, or if you would like to join the group and see what you can do locally in your area, I would encourage you to attend that meeting, which is, again, December 12th at 2 p.m. With that, let's go ahead and get Wade on the line, because we want to make sure to have as much time as we can to talk with him. Wade, are you there?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I think I got rid of the music that was on there. So what listeners don't know is when I reached out to them earlier is that we had some background music there. So I think we were able to get rid of that before we got on the air here. And I always kind of start the show the same way. I like to share just a little bit about you with listeners so that they can get to know you. Now, you are a professor of retirement income at the American College of Financial Services. You also serve as a principal and director for McLean Asset Management and chief planning strategist of software provider InStream Solutions. Now, I know you. I'm taking as a financial advisor, I'm taking my retirement income certification, my RICP, and I'm on the third module, and you are actually one of the instructors in that course, and so I know you through the videos. But for listeners, just to let you know, Wade is, as far as when it comes to retirement income planning, academia, you are one of the top leading voices out there right now. And so I'm very excited to have you on the show. Would you be able to share a little bit about yourself, maybe outside of the bio, so that we can get to know you just a little bit better?
Sure, yeah. So I did my PhD in economics, and then after that, I finished that in 2003, and then moved and lived in Japan for 10 years, and came back to the U.S. now with a wife and 3 kids in 2013, living in the Philadelphia area now. I'm doing a lot of traveling these days to speak around the country. I've been to Houston a few times, most recently just in November I was there. And, got 3 kids now, ages 9, 6, and 1, and doing a lot with work, writing books these days, and just keeping busy that way.
Excellent. And this is the newest book, before we dive right into it here, the newest book, How Much Can I Spend in Retirement? You had written one in the past about reverse mortgages and using, kind of changing the mindset, because many people had seen reverse mortgages as there was some negative connotations there. But the book, How to Use Reverse Mortgages to Secure Your Retirement, that's kind of considered the standard now for financial planning and looking or diving into that topic. Can you tell me a little bit about why you wrote How Much Can I Spend in Retirement?
So my whole interest in retirement really just began with my own personal interest in saving and planning and building long-term financial plans. And then when I was in graduate school, in the early 2000s, President Bush had created that proposal to personalize part of Social Security. And so I was testing how that sort of program would perform. And that was really the same skills I use today in terms of people now saving, looking at the impact of market returns and so forth, and then trying to spend from that asset base. That's really what I do now with retirement income planning, and I just find it a lot of fun to do that type of research. I write computer programs to simulate retirement outcomes with different randomness created by financial markets and how long people will live and so forth, and really found that to be my niche.
I know. I as a financial advisor, I'm working more with really pension people from the state. So it's people who are up and over 50, not 55, 59 and a half. They are right about to retire. And the stuff that we have covered in that RICP course is easily translatable to the type of people that I'm working with. A lot of the baby boomers, they'll ask this question, how much can I spend in retirement? But come to find out, there's a lot more to it than just kind of the surface approach there. What are some of the right approaches to withdrawal rates? How complicated is that? Can we dive into that?
Well, yeah, I suppose the starting point for anything, and if your listeners begin to look on the internet about retirement income planning, they'll quickly come across this 4% rule of thumb, which just says that if you have an investment portfolio and you have at least 50% stock, so it's actually calling for a pretty aggressive stock allocation, but that you should be able to take out 4% of your assets. So just to give a simple number, if you have $1 million in your investments, taking out $40,000 in year one, and then you should be able to sustain that spending level, making adjustments for inflation, and have that money last for at least 30 years. And that's the starting point for everything now, but then it's just a matter of digging into all the assumptions behind that rule of thumb and how things would differ if you modify those assumptions to account for a whole host of issues about reasons why that 4% could be too high are things like low interest rates, the high stock market levels, the fact that people are really living longer than they have in the past. But then also reasons why that number could be on the low side is just if people have flexibility to reduce their spending and everything else, then that could encourage them to use a more aggressive distribution rate. But it's all, when you're talking about how much you can spend from investments, it's all focused around that 4% rule of thumb as a starting point. And also then looking beyond investments as well, you have many other avenues with insurance and lifetime income through income annuities and so forth.
I think that's a great place to start, because if I was a retiree and I got on the internet and I started looking, it wouldn't be that long before you stumble across that 4% rule. But what you've done is you've kind of done a deep dive into. Can you tell us a little bit about the history with Bingen and some of these assumptions and why the 4% rule, it may not be that simple?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so the 4% rule, it was Bill Bingen, a financial planner in California, did that research in the early 1990s. And he was responding to, in the 1990s, people were saying, historically, the stock market will outperform, give you about 7% inflation-adjusted returns every year. And so if you plug that into a spreadsheet, that every year your portfolio grows 7% after inflation, then it makes it look like 7% is a safe withdrawal rate, and that you never run out of money, you never even dip into your underlying principal, and you can use 100% stocks in retirement. And Bill Bingen just recognized that that was crazy and sought out to explain why, and in doing so it's because of market volatility. It's because you don't get a fixed return every year. You don't get the average stock market return every year. And if the markets go down in early retirement and you're trying to fund a particular spending goal, then you start to dig a hole for that portfolio. You're spending an increasing percentage of what's left. You're creating the hurdle that the markets have to grow at least that higher percentage to avoid further depleting the portfolio. And then even if the overall markets recover after a downturn, it's hard for the portfolios of retirees to recover. And so with a lot of other simple assumptions, he pointed out the impact of that market volatility, leading to something like 4% being a more reasonable spending rate for retirement than something like 7%.
Wade, I know as an advisor, there is a lot of focus on just the investment drawdown side, that 4%. But what the industry is changing, and we're seeing more of a focus on this retirement income planning, and we're learning that it's more than just drawing down the portfolio. You go deeper into this, almost a system, or when you talk about in the book something about life satisfaction. Can you talk a little bit more about what factors are involved in that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I try to conclude the book with, I call it the retirement care analysis, and it's really all these factors to think about to decide how much can you spend from your investments and what sort of asset allocation should you use, and it's related to capacity to reduce your spending, or capacity. You have other resources available outside of investments, so you can be more aggressive. Aspirations, what are your spending objectives and how reasonable are they? Realities, and that relates to the fact that with our historically low interest rates right now, you do have to be more concerned about numbers like the 4% rule as being too aggressive in a low interest rate environment. And then emotional constraints about just things like how do you feel about stock market volatility, how do you feel about other financial tools and so forth, and can you stay the course, or are you somebody who might panic and sell off your stock positions if the stock market goes down, which is really a big mistake to try to avoid. But all these different factors that will in the end help to determine a sustainable, reasonable spending strategy for retirement.
So one of the things that you touch upon in the book is that sometimes people end up, and this is probably not the case most of the time, but sometimes people end up with more money than they thought they were going to end up with at the end. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that actually, with a lot of research being done looking at household survey data following households over time in retirement, we hear a lot about this retirement crisis, which is the idea that people have not saved enough for retirement, and the average American getting to retirement with a very small amount of financial assets and will have to mostly rely on Social Security and home equity. But for people who have saved some assets, where something like the 4% rule is actually meaningful to think about because they have a financial portfolio where 4% of that portfolio is a meaningful number to be thinking about. The people with assets really do seem to underspend. They, even with very conservative assumptions, they spend less than really maybe at a very conservative type of assumption reasonable. And it may be a host of factors, that just this idea, the 4% rule assumes you're willing to spend down your principal. And for a lot of people, they're willing to spend income generated from their portfolios, but they're not very comfortable spending down principal. And then as well, they may just worry about outliving their money. And so they really that's another reason why they may not be comfortable spending down principal. And then there's all the contingencies facing retirees with health care, spending shocks, long-term care events, and all these spending surprises that can happen that in the end also just leave people feeling like they may have a pretty big base of financial assets, but they're just not comfortable spending it because they're worried they may need it for these types of spending shocks that can happen later in retirement.
So it almost, as a planner myself, it almost sounds like a Goldilocks zone. Either there's not enough, or you end up with too much at the end. I'm going to sidestep here for a moment, because one of the things you talk about in the book when we talk about spending or spending the principal down on the subject of spending is spending flexibility, and you did a paper or some research with Michael Finke on spending flexibility and safe withdrawal rates. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how that influenced some of the stuff in the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's getting at the idea that for most people, they're not just reliant on their investments. Somebody who with Social Security and who may also have another traditional company pension and maybe has some other income coming from an annuity, might have most of their lifestyle expenses covered by resources from outside their investment portfolio. And that can create a lot of flexibility that your lifestyle is no longer as vulnerable to if you spend down your investment portfolio and then you can't take as big of distributions from your investments in the future. Well, your lifestyle is pretty much covered. And that can create a lot of flexibility for people in terms of being able to spend more from their investments today, enjoying their early retirement more, because they do have that flexibility to reduce the expenses from, or the distributions from their investments later in retirement, since they really do have so much of their lifestyle covered with these other resources from outside the investment portfolio. So spending flexibility is very important. It gives you the capacity to spend more aggressively early in retirement because you have the flexibility to make those cuts later in retirement.
Wait, I'm a baby boomer. I'm about to retire. It's scary. I'm about to turn off that paycheck that's coming in each week, and I'm about to kind of make that leap into retirement. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest roadblocks or risk out there for people who are just now entering into retirement?
Well, yeah, retirement's a completely different way of life from what people are used to. You're no longer just adding new savings, but you're now having to really think about taking distributions and spending down the asset base. And that's really a different experience for people. That pre-retirement, you have more flexibility to get back on track if your money is mostly in the stock market, or at least a big chunk of it, but you have that flexibility to respond to a stock market downturn. Post-retirement, you're really becoming more committed to your financial plan. You're going to have one opportunity for a successful retirement, and it may be harder to go back to work. It may be harder to make other kinds of adjustments if the stock market goes down. And so your views and attitudes towards stock market risk can change in retirement because your lifestyle can become more vulnerable. And I think people who are really relying on the idea that stocks will perform well, which they have for a number of years now, but there's no guarantee that will continue indefinitely. And if your retirement's dependent on getting that consistent stock market growth, it can really make for an uncomfortable retirement in terms of the worry about the stock market. And if something does happen, what impact would that have on the financial plan in terms of allowing it to work? So that's really, retirees need to think about stock market risk in a different way, because their mindset is transitioning from accumulating and adding to their asset base to having to take distributions from their asset base.
So that is a total shift in the way that people have thought, because you're as you're accumulating, you've got that buy and hold mentality, and we've got years to get to where we're trying to go. But then when you turn off that income, you're really changing that focus onto distribution and how to make that money stretch and last. So it's two different mindsets, two different ways of thinking of something. I would regret having you on the show and not asking you about reverse mortgages. So where does that play a role when you're a retiree? I know we do run into clients that maybe they don't have as big a bucket of retirement assets saved up, but they have some equity in the house. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Right. And so really what makes retirement different is pre-retirement, it's more of an assets-only model. You're just, how do you grow and maximize your assets? In retirement, you really have to match your assets to your liabilities. And what I mean is just, you have expenses in retirement, and how can you best position your assets to meet those expenses? And the conventional wisdom around home equity is generally that it's an asset you don't really touch. You leave it in the background as, well, if you do have a long-term care expense or something like that, you may think about selling the home at that point to fund that sort of spending shock, and then otherwise home equity becomes part of a legacy asset to be provided to heirs. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way to incorporate home equity, which for a lot of Americans is going to be a very significant asset for their retirement. Reverse mortgages, and they have gotten a lot of bad press, so I kind of shared that. I knew it's something I needed to dig into more deeply, and when I did, I was really impressed and surprised by what I saw about reverse mortgages. Just provide a tool to create more liquidity to be able to spend from the home's equity in the same way that you spend from an investment portfolio. And by being able to coordinate, when do you spend from your investments, when do you spend from your home equity, that can just lay a foundation for a more efficient retirement income strategy that could potentially support more spending and or more legacy at the end, even in spite of the costs of setting up the reverse mortgage and the costs of the interest on a growing loan balance for the reverse mortgage. When I do research on that, I incorporate realistic costs for all of that and just look at how does incorporating home equity into a retirement plan through a reverse mortgage impact the outcomes, and find that in many cases it can really help build better retirement income plans. And that's what motivated me to then write a book about reverse mortgages.
Now, if Wade is saying this, the idea of going back and doing a cost analysis, that's what kind of drew my eye towards it, because I had kind of bought into some of the negative press in the past, but come to find out, there have been lots of changes as far as caps on what fees are associated with the loans, and so there's a lot of, I guess, guidelines that might not have been there prior to the housing bubble, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so partly, definitely, this is a government-administered program. It's private lenders make the loans, but they have to follow strict rules issued through the government. And, there are caps on all that. But I think the reason fees had come down was more through competition between the firms, and the firms being able to issue those loans and then securitize them, which may be a bad word after the financial crisis, but securitize that debt for a premium, and then they're able to make their money through the securities markets and to not then have to charge that to the individual borrowing through the reverse mortgage. And that's, I think, a lot of what drove down costs. Now, that being said, there was a change to the rules around reverse mortgages that went into effect October 2nd, and the government is now asking for a higher initial mortgage insurance premium payment that will raise the initial cost of setting up a reverse mortgage relative to what they had been the last few years. And when I published my book, I'm now getting to the finishing stages of updating my book for the new rules and finding there's still value for the reverse mortgage. But prior to October 2nd, you could hear cases of $125 as the full upfront cost to set up a reverse mortgage. And that's going to be impossible now with the increased mortgage insurance premiums required at the beginning.
I think that's a testament for people who are retiring and seeking advice and seeking counsel on this, because it is a moving target. This was something that up until October 2nd of this year, and the laws change. And when we talk about things that are ancillary to retirement, like Medicare and Social Security, these can be moving targets. So it's a very, what seems maybe simple on the outside can be very, very complex. What other roadblocks would you tell a retiree that they need to make sure is included in their game plan before they jump into retirement?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, healthcare is going to be important for anybody retiring before 65, and then you also just have to think, I mean, not sure what age the person's retiring at, but then you also have the rules around taking distributions from your retirement plans before age 59 and a half. And I think an important roadblock as well, just outside of the whole financial considerations, is what will you do in retirement, and do you have a plan for how you're going to spend your time? The kind of tragedy for a lot of people is that they really lose their identity when they leave work, and they may think they'll want to play golf every day or something like that, but it could get boring after a while, and then what do they do? And if they just fall into watching TV all the time or that sort of thing, that can lead to a very unhappy retirement and can actually lead someone to die sooner than if they had stayed active and engaged and involved in their communities. And so to just make sure you have a plan for being engaged and involved and having a happy, successful retirement, even just outside of the financial question, that's an important factor to be considering.
I love that, because that is an important point. I have a friend that says if your retirement plan is sitting in the lazy boy and watching TV, well, that's not going to work out for you very well. Wade, thank you so much for being on the show. We're bouncing towards the end of the show here, and I want to put an offer out there. Next time you are in Houston, let me know, and we'll have you here live in the studio. I didn't realize that you come here frequently, so let me know that the offer is out there for you. For listeners who'd like to find out more about Wade, you can purchase his book, I'm sure, through Amazon. The book is called How Much Can I Spend in Retirement? Or you could go to his online website, blog, retirementresearcher.com. Wade, what have I forgot to ask you that you would like to share with our listeners today?
I think it's important to think about how retirement's different from pre-retirement. And I mentioned before about just in retirement you have to match your assets to your expenses, and that's where it's easy to go astray with some of the logic or conventional wisdom or rules of thumb around retirement. They haven't made that link. So this idea that the stock market always outperforms the bond market over long periods may be true, but for retirement, when you're really dependent on taking distributions and matching your assets to your expenses, all that, it's a different framework, and it's a different way to think, and so retirement income planning really is different, and so that's just what I would emphasize at the end of our discussion.
Wade, thank you so much for joining us today on the show, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and you have been listening to KPFT Houston.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.